Imagine a cargo ship, vast as a city block, gliding silently into Rotterdam's sprawling port, its immense holds brimming with crude oil. The year is 2005. On a trading floor in Houston, the screens of Michael Chen, a focused commodities trader, glowed with green numbers, confirming yet another seamless transaction. The air hums with a quiet, almost subconscious confidence, a belief in an order so fundamental it felt like gravity itself. For decades, the world operated on an invisible truth. Oil flowed and dollars paid. This wasn't just a market mechanism. It was the rhythmic pulse of global prosperity, ensuring that the wheels of industry turned without a hitch, fueled by an abundant, predictably priced resource. You might remember a time when the world felt simpler, more certain, when the future seemed a direct, logical extension of today's hard work, all underwritten by an unshakable global financial architecture. This was the unchallenged reign of the petrodollar, an era built on an implicit promise to you, to everyone. Tell us, where are you watching this from? Your perspective matters as we unravel a story that touches every corner of the globe. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate design. After the Nixon shock in 1971, a crucial agreement with Saudi Arabia effectively cemented the petrodollar system. Oil, the world's most vital commodity, could only be bought and sold internationally using U.S. dollars. This created an insatiable, perpetual global demand for the dollar, turning it into the ultimate safe haven and the lubricant for all international trade. Nations needed dollars to buy energy, which meant they needed to hold dollars in their reserves, fueling a robust market for U.S. Treasury bonds. This seemingly technical arrangement, often overlooked in daily life, underpinned decades of unprecedented American economic and geopolitical dominance, a silent engine of stability that extended far beyond Wall Street, touching every household, every budget, every plan for the future. You, like Michael Chen, likely grew up internalizing this reality. The implicit promise was clear: work hard, follow the established rules, and your future would be secure. For a commodities trader like Michael, specializing in crude oil futures in Houston, this system wasn't just a backdrop. It was the very canvas upon which his career was painted. He meticulously navigated the established rules of dollar-denominated contracts, believing in a meritocracy where diligence and expertise guaranteed success. The collective illusion was one of an unshakable global order, where economic growth and stability were inherently tied to the dollar's strength and the reliable flow of cheap, dollar-denominated energy. Every nation, every central bank, every corporation operated under the unquestioned assumption that this arrangement offered the most efficient, the most secure pathway for international trade and financial reserves. If you want to understand the hidden forces shaping our world, subscribe now. We uncover truths others won't explain until the very end. This wasn't merely a convenience. It was a foundational pillar of modern life. The system seemed to reward adherence, to value consistency, to ensure that the global economy moved forward with predictable momentum. You could plan your investments, your career, your retirement, confident that the underlying currents of global finance would remain stable. This confidence was rooted in the dollar's unchallenged role, a currency so dominant it felt less like a national instrument and more like a universal language of commerce. Yet, beneath this veneer of unwavering stability lay a delicate architecture. This apparent permanence, this seamless operation, relied entirely on a set of assumptions that, while widely accepted, were never truly tested against the shifting tides of geopolitical ambition and economic evolution. It felt eternal. But what if eternity was merely a long moment of undisturbed equilibrium? The system promised not just stability, but growth, opportunity, and a clear path forward for those who played by its rules. For Michael Chen, watching his parents build a life in America, this system represented the pinnacle of meritocracy, a global stage where talent and hard work were universally rewarded. The flow of capital, the pricing of resources, the very framework of international relations, all seemed to coalesce around this single, powerful anchor. It fostered an environment where complex global transactions became routine, almost invisible, allowing attention to focus on innovation, expansion, and individual advancement. But every system, no matter how robust, carries within it the seeds of its own transformation, especially when its core tenets are taken for granted, when its unchallenged reign blinds us to the subtle shifts occurring beneath the surface. You might look at today's headlines, at the bewildering shifts in global power and economic uncertainty, and wonder how we arrived here. How did a world that once appeared so predictable, so logically ordered, transform into one riddled with volatility and doubt? This wasn't a sudden collapse, nor was it the work of random chance. The era of unquestioned stability, where global economic growth seemed an inherent right, where the dollar's supremacy was as natural as the sunrise, was built upon foundations that, while appearing solid, were silently eroding. We lived in an intricate, beautiful machine, believing its gears would turn forever without maintenance or reevaluation. But nothing lasts forever, especially when the fundamental rules of the game are challenged. This is not fiction. It is consequence. You might believe that power, once attained, is eternal, an unshakable force guiding global affairs. Yet, even the most formidable structures can be undermined by the very hands that shaped them. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, a new strategic imperative crystallized in Washington: to leverage every available tool to secure national interests and project influence. The U.S. dollar, already the world's undisputed reserve currency and the invisible bedrock of international oil trade, underwent a profound transformation. It was no longer just a neutral medium of exchange. It became an instrument of foreign policy, a potent financial weapon wielded to exert pressure on adversaries. At that moment, this decision appeared entirely rational, even a sophisticated evolution in statecraft. It promised immense leverage without direct military engagement, an elegant extension of American financial might into the complex arena of geopolitics, a seemingly modern and effective way to manage global threats. You might have seen it as a sign of strength, a necessary adaptation to a changing world. Yet, within this seemingly ingenious strategy lay a fundamental, almost imperceptible flaw, a structural error that would ripple outwards with devastating long-term consequences. When you weaponize a global utility, you inadvertently force the world to seek alternatives. The petrodollar system, designed for efficiency and stability, was inherently vulnerable to a loss of trust. By treating access to the dollar as a privilege to be granted or revoked based on political alignment, the U.S. inadvertently sent a clear message to every nation. Dependency on a single, politically wielded financial anchor carried unacceptable risks. This wasn't an immediate crisis. It was a slow-acting poison, quietly eroding the very foundation of unquestioned dollar supremacy. The world began to perceive the dollar not just as a global currency, but as a potential liability, creating a silent, strategic imperative for de-risking. Initially, these early tremors were largely dismissed as isolated incidents, mere geopolitical skirmishes on the fringes of the global financial system. Sanctioned nations and their trading partners, facing the immediate threat of dollar exclusion, began to explore rudimentary, often inefficient workarounds. They sought bilateral agreements, experimented with local currency settlements, and quietly started building parallel financial channels. For Michael Chen, immersed in the bustling, dollar-centric trading floors of Houston, these were distant rumblings, anomalies in an otherwise predictable world. He continued to meticulously analyze crude oil futures, confident that the established rules of dollar-denominated contracts would always prevail. His world, built on the unwavering flow of dollar-backed energy, seemed immune to these minor disruptions. He believed his expertise in this system was his shield, an assurance of continued success. But what began as isolated workarounds soon coalesced into something far more significant: a quiet but determined global movement towards financial autonomy. Nations, witnessing the dollar's weaponization, started investing in alternative payment infrastructures like China's CIPS or Russia's SPFS, designed specifically to bypass the SWIFT system and its dollar dependency. Bilateral currency swap agreements proliferated, steadily reducing the need for dollars in specific trade corridors. These weren't sudden ruptures, but gradual, almost invisible shifts, like tectonic plates grinding against each other beneath the ocean floor. For Michael, this translated into subtle, yet persistent, market anomalies. Unpredictable volatility flickered across his screens, minor deviations from the patterns he had spent decades mastering. He felt the first gnawing unease that something fundamental was changing, that the market was no longer behaving as it should. What decisions, seemingly logical at the time, do you believe are shaping our world in profound, unforeseen ways right now? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel to understand how these choices, often made in the shadows, inevitably lead to the realities you experience today. This growing dissonance became Michael's constant companion. His ingrained belief that hard work and adherence to established protocols guaranteed success was being challenged by an invisible force. He had done everything right, mastered the intricacies of dollar-denominated trading, built a stable career, provided for his family. Yet, the very foundations of that system, the predictable market mechanisms he relied upon, were now giving way to an opaque landscape of geopolitical maneuvers and fluctuating currency dynamics. His expertise, once a source of immense pride, felt increasingly devalued. The future, which he had once envisioned as a direct, logical extension of his diligent efforts, now appeared fundamentally uncertain, a direct consequence of structural forces far beyond his control or understanding. He felt a deep sense of betrayal, as if the implicit promise of the system was being silently revoked. Simultaneously, the global stage itself was undergoing a profound reordering. The rise of major non-Western economic powers, particularly China and Russia, was not merely an economic expansion, but a strategic assertion of sovereignty. These nations, no longer content to operate solely within a dollar-centric framework, actively pursued bilateral trade agreements in local currencies. This wasn't merely a reaction to U.S. sanctions, it was a proactive move towards a multipolar world order, a deliberate attempt to carve out financial autonomy and reduce vulnerability to external leverage. The petrodollar system, once a unipolar anchor, was now confronting a diversifying global power structure that saw its dominance as an impediment, not a benefit. This push for de-dollarization was becoming an economic imperative, not just a political protest. The structural error of the petrodollar system, its inherent reliance on unquestioning trust and universal acceptance, was now glaringly exposed. Its logic began to fail precisely as the perception grew among sovereign nations that dollar dependency carried unacceptable geopolitical risks. The problem wasn't a temporary market correction or a cyclical downturn. It was a fundamental shift in the global financial architecture. The system, once heralded as the most efficient and secure pathway for international trade, was visibly struggling to deliver on its implicit promise of stability and neutrality. You were witnessing the slow, deliberate unraveling of a foundational assumption, where the very instrument of global commerce became a tool of division, forcing a reevaluation of economic partnerships and allegiances. The tension was no longer merely a low hum in the background, it was a growing crescendo, a discordant note in the symphony of global finance. What once appeared as minor geopolitical adjustments or temporary diplomatic spats now revealed itself as a profound, systemic challenge to the very architecture of global trade. Michael Chen, watching his trading screens with a growing sense of unease, saw not just price fluctuations, but the digital manifestation of a world fragmenting before his eyes. The seamless efficiency he had built his entire professional life upon was visibly eroding, replaced by an unsettling, pervasive uncertainty. The petrodollar, once the silent, robust engine of global stability, was beginning to stutter, its gears grinding as nations actively sought alternative paths. The unquestioned reign of a single currency was giving way to a nascent, complex, multipolar reality, where the old rules no longer guaranteed the old outcomes, leaving you to wonder what new paradigm would emerge from the wreckage of the familiar. You might recall how, in the aftermath of 9/11 and intensifying with recent conflicts, a new strategy emerged in Washington. The U.S. began to treat access to its currency, the mighty dollar, not as a universal medium of exchange, but as a privilege, a potent tool of foreign policy to exert pressure on adversaries. This decision, while perhaps appearing rational and effective in the short term, unleashed an unforeseen chain reaction. Suddenly, nations found themselves in an uncomfortable position, their economic stability tethered to a currency that could be weaponized against them. This wasn't a subtle shift. It was a clear signal, forcing them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Dependency on a single, politically wielded financial anchor carried unacceptable risks. The immediate effect was a heightened, almost frantic search for alternatives, a quiet global scramble to de-risk from the dollar's embrace. This wasn't merely a theoretical exercise, it spurred concrete action. Sanctioned countries, alongside their wary trading partners, began to quietly build parallel financial universes. You saw the gradual development of non-dollar payment infrastructures, like China's CIPS or Russia's SPFS, designed specifically to bypass the SWIFT system and its dollar chokehold. Simultaneously, bilateral currency swap agreements proliferated, reducing the absolute necessity for dollars in specific trade corridors. These weren't sudden ruptures in the financial fabric, but rather a methodical, almost invisible stitching of new pathways. Each new agreement, each alternative infrastructure, chipped away at the dollar's universal reign, steadily eroding its unquestioned dominance and creating a mosaic of localized financial arrangements that once seemed impossible. This was the quiet revolution, unfolding beneath the headlines. For Michael Chen, sitting amidst the glowing screens of Houston, these macro shifts translated into a visceral, deeply unsettling reality. The predictable market mechanisms he had meticulously mastered over decades began to behave erratically. Unpredictable volatility flickered across his crude oil futures screens, not as isolated anomalies, but as persistent, unsettling deviations from established patterns. Major transactions, once reliably flowing through dollar channels, now seemed to bypass them, leaving gaps in his data and making long-term forecasting an increasingly futile exercise. His trading margins, once robust, began to erode, a direct financial consequence of a world fragmenting beneath his feet. His expertise, his carefully honed skill, was being devalued by forces he couldn't control, leaving him with a gnawing sense that the rules had changed without warning. For nations, this shift presented a complex trade-off. Engaging in non-dollar trades often meant increased transaction costs and reduced liquidity, a tangible economic burden. Yet, it offered an invaluable perceived gain: financial autonomy, a shield against the weaponization of a single currency. This exposed a core structural antagonist: the inherent limitations of a unipolar global financial system attempting to serve an increasingly multipolar world. Economic nationalism, once a dormant force, surged as emerging powers asserted their financial sovereignty. No longer content to operate within a framework that could be unilaterally imposed or withdrawn. The very architecture designed for efficiency now fostered division, forcing nations to prioritize resilience over integration, even at a cost. You are witnessing how the escalating use of unilateral financial sanctions, once seen as a surgical tool, became a blunt instrument, inadvertently incentivizing de-dollarization. The complex, often opaque web of international banking regulations, which historically favored existing hegemonies, now seemed to actively push nations towards seeking refuge outside its reach. Moreover, the shifting global energy landscape itself, with new producers and consumers altering traditional trade routes and dependencies, added another layer of systemic pressure. These weren't individual villains, but an interplay of powerful, abstract structural forces that collectively pushed against the petrodollar's continued dominance. They painted a stark picture. The system was not just challenged, but actively being circumvented, its authority diminished with each new workaround. If you want to understand these profound, often hidden shifts that reshape your world, subscribe now. We unravel the truths others won't explain, connecting the dots that impact your future. Then came the next crucial step, a direct challenge to the petrodollar's very core. Major energy consumers, like China and India, began to demand and accept non-dollar settlements for oil and gas, often from suppliers like Russia or even key members of OPEC+. This wasn't merely about convenience, it was a strategic declaration. Imagine the immense cargo ships, once paid for exclusively in dollars, now facilitating transactions in yuan or rupees. This fundamental shift wasn't theoretical. It was happening in real time, on a significant scale. Each such transaction, once an anomaly, now became part of a growing pattern. A visible crack in the foundation of an edifice once thought impregnable. The world's most vital commodity was slowly, deliberately, detaching itself from its dollar anchor. The immediate effect of this was a direct, undeniable challenge to the petrodollar's core tenet: the mandated pricing and settlement of international oil in U.S. dollars. The accumulated consequence quickly became measurable. reports from global financial institutions, often quietly, began to confirm a persistent decline in the dollar's share of global energy transactions. Simultaneously, central bank reserves, once overwhelmingly dollar-denominated, showed a diversification, a deliberate move away from a single currency. What was once a past advantage for the USE, its currency's unassailable position, was rapidly transforming into a present vulnerability. The silent engine of stability began to sputter, its fuel lines rerouted, as the world consciously sought alternative power sources for its economic machinery. This ripple effect extended far beyond trading floors and central banks, reaching directly into your pocket. The softening global demand for the dollar began to manifest as rising inflationary pressures in dollar-dependent economies. Goods imported became more expensive, your purchasing power subtly diminished, and the cost of living climbed. Simultaneously, a palpable unease settled into financial markets. The future stability of the U.S. currency, once taken for granted, became a subject of intense speculative debate. You felt the anxiety, the underlying tremor as the bedrock of global finance shifted. The implicit promise of stable prices and predictable economic currents, once delivered by the petrodollar, was visibly faltering, leaving you to grapple with an increasingly uncertain economic landscape. The structural turning point, the decision that rendered the petrodollar's decline largely irreversible, wasn't a single grand declaration. Instead, it was the collective, strategic choice by major energy producers and consumers, particularly key members of OPEC+ and major importing nations, to actively pursue and implement non-dollar denominated oil and gas contracts on a significant scale. This was the point of no return. Imagine, this could have been a controlled transition if the U.S. had proactively engaged in multilateral financial reform, fostering a truly multi-currency reserve system. But the immediate perceived benefits of dollar hegemony, cheap borrowing, seigniorage, and geopolitical leverage, tragically outweighed the long-term structural risks, sacrificing a controlled evolution for transient power. The cost of that opportunity lost was profound. The chance to shepherd a gradual, managed transition to a more equitable global financial order, preserving some degree of U.S. influence. From this point onward, the options became starkly limited. The world could either adapt to this emerging multipolar financial reality, embracing its complexities and challenges, or attempt to enforce a weakening, increasingly anachronistic unipolar system through escalating geopolitical friction. The tragic irony is that the latter path only accelerated the very fragmentation it sought to prevent. You are now living through the consequences of that choice, witnessing the inevitable unraveling of a system that, by refusing to evolve, sealed its own fate and irrevocably altered the global economic landscape. You might feel these are distant, abstract shifts, confined to financial reports, but the evidence is undeniable, manifesting in tangible ways across the global economy. Institutions like the IMF and major central banks now openly confirm a measurable diversification away from the dollar in global foreign exchange reserves, a strategic pivot you might not see on headlines but impacts every nation's financial security. Furthermore, state-owned energy giants and national oil companies are publicly engaging in bilateral oil for yuan or oil for rupee deals, a direct challenge to the dollar's historic monopoly. Major trading blocs, most notably the BRICS nations, are actively discussing and urgently developing alternative payment systems and even common currencies for trade settlement. This isn't theoretical, it's a new reality unfolding before your eyes, redefining who holds the ultimate economic cards. The data itself paints a stark picture, showing a persistent decline in the dollar's share of global trade invoicing and interbank payments, a silent erosion of its universal acceptance. This isn't merely a statistic, it's a palpable economic impact you might feel directly. Countries burdened with significant dollar-denominated debt now face increased instability, as the dollar's once assumed future strength becomes a volatile question mark, directly leading to higher import costs and domestic inflation that erodes your purchasing power. Companies, once confident in seamless global supply chains, now grapple with disruptions, new trade barriers, and currency volatility, forcing them to reevaluate their entire operational model. You are witnessing the refragmentation of a world that once championed seamless integration. Consider the inheritance for future generations. A multipolar financial landscape vastly different from the one Michael Chen knew. This new world is characterized by increased currency volatility, a mosaic of regional trade blocs, and almost certainly higher transaction costs in international trade, making global commerce inherently more complex and less efficient. The global role of the United States, once an unchallenged financial architect, will fundamentally shift. It is transitioning from the singular conductor of the global orchestra to merely one of several influential players, a rebalancing that entails a corresponding loss of economic leverage and geopolitical influence. This isn't a decline, but a recalibration, one that will redefine the power dynamics you've always taken for granted. This evolving reality means a diminished capacity for any single nation to unilaterally impose sanctions or dictate global financial norms, as the tools for such actions are diversified and diluted. The traditional model of globalized free trade, once seamlessly underpinned by a single reserve currency, will inevitably evolve into a more fragmented, localized, and potentially less efficient system, demanding entirely new strategies for international commerce and investment. The very social contract within many nations, built on fundamental assumptions of stable prices and unchallenged global access, will be profoundly tested. This will lead to significant adjustments in your living standards and economic expectations, forcing you to adapt to a world where stability is no longer a given, but a hard-won achievement. If you want to understand these profound, often hidden shifts that reshape your world, subscribe now. We unravel the truths others won't explain, connecting the dots that impact your future, and keeping you ahead of the curve as this new global order unfolds. So, what does Michael Chen's story and the unraveling of the petrodollar truly teach us? It reveals that even the most deeply entrenched and seemingly immutable systems are, at their core, merely constructs. They are inherently vulnerable to the relentless forces of geopolitical evolution and the strategic imperative of economic adaptation. This narrative underscores a profound, often dangerous illusion of permanence that consistently blinds societies to impending structural shifts. We tend to believe what is will always be, failing to see the tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface until the ground beneath our feet begins to shake. This isn't a unique phenomenon. It's a recurring pattern throughout history, one you must recognize. The core lesson here, transcending the specific case of the petrodollar, is a universal pattern of immense consequence: over-reliance on a single point of control. Whether that control is financial, political, or energetic, inevitably breeds vulnerability. When one entity holds too much sway, when a single currency or system becomes the sole conduit for global transactions, it naturally incentivizes others to seek alternatives, to de-risk, and to build parallel structures. This isn't an act of malice, but a logical, self-preservation instinct inherent in sovereign nations and rational economic actors. You are witnessing the natural response to an imbalanced architecture, a fundamental truth about power and dependency. Why should you care about this complex, seemingly distant financial transition? Because the shift away from the petrodollar is far from an abstract debate confined to trading floors or central banks. It directly impacts the cost of the energy you consume daily, the inherent stability of your nation's currency, and, consequently, the prices of every single good you purchase. More profoundly, it reshapes the very distribution of global power, altering alliances, trade routes, and the geopolitical landscape that defines your future. This isn't just about currencies. It's about the foundational rules of the world you inhabit, rules that are being rewritten right now, with or without your awareness. Understanding this profound structural shift is not merely academic. It is absolutely critical to navigating the emerging, complex world order that is taking shape. The illusion of a singular, predictable path has shattered, replaced by a mosaic of competing interests and evolving dependencies. The era of unquestioned stability, where global systems felt eternal, is giving way to a new reality, one demanding constant reevaluation and adaptation. The world you thought you knew is gone, not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless grinding of new gears. Its transformation is an ongoing process, one that continues to unfold day by day, defining the very contours of your tomorrow.